this podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan. It's always a good sign for me where I'm speaking to someone who's equally frustrated with technology. And
Yes.
I enjoyed how we tried setting this up right now. Both of us are a bit sort of amateurish when it comes to technology. So I enjoy this moment myself. It's not frustrating. Between an iPad, an iPhone, sometimes microphones are not working. Getting the angle just right.
Amateurish is an exaggeration in my case.
Yeah, it's a thrill for me. It's a learning experience for me. I've done many episodes where people come sort of prepared and they know exactly what they're doing, and I'm the idiot in the room. So I look, in a way, it's humbling for me at times.
No. Now we have we have other idiots in the room, so you don't have to worry about that.
I would like to think otherwise, that we're actually the intelligent ones, that we're too distracted for this nonsense.
Yeah. Can use this excuse, yes.
Exactly. Bashshar, for many reasons, this is an honor for me. I think my intellectual curiosity started many years ago, just wandering the streets of Hamra. Maybe at times, I was going to say at times going to an AUB class, but I don't know if the intellectual curiosity was always there. I think it extended beyond AUB's campus. And there are many conversations I had with friends, with professors, that made me think twice about many issues. And although I never took a course with you, you were my master's thesis capstone supervisor, but I don't think that that's really what I think attracted me to our conversations. I think it goes in reverse. The capstone was sort of just the icing on the cake. There are many occasions I'd be sitting in Hamra, usually at Bread Republic. This is dating ourselves a bit. And we would have friendly exchanges, at times Cafe Yunus, or at times literally just running into each other on Jeanne d'Arc. And I enjoyed those moments immensely. And there's one moment in particular, and I think it fits well to your recent piece, and I'm going to get into this. We were both walking, I believe this is on Bliss Street. Both of us had sort of a book sack, and both of us had photocopied versions of this book, The IRA Predicament. And we were both kind of sort of a bit cautious the way we were holding it. We're like, do you want to see what I have? Do you want to see what I have? It turned out to be the same book, same exact book.
Yes, I remember.
And for me, it's fun because I don't know many people that would be carrying this book, many years after its publication. But I was curious about largely a sort of a controversial author and what he was writing years earlier. You happen to hold the same book. And I think it's quite fitting because the IRA Predicament is now literally the Lebanese Predicament. And that's the article you recently wrote at the Center for Global Policy. And I don't think that title is an accident. I think it's actually deliberate. But before we jump into that stuff, it crossed my mind earlier that we were scheduling this episode on the 1-year anniversary of the October 17 uprising. And I think it was 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks into the protests. This is shortly after Hariri resigned, or just maybe in the days leading up to that resignation. I ran into you in Martyrs Square, and this was late at night. Protests were sort of beginning to die down a bit. So this maybe towards 11, even midnight. And we were sitting, watching foreign correspondents interviewing all types of protesters. And we had a friendly chat about Hariri's, in a way, imminent resignation. It was happening or was about to happen. and I shared with you sort of private words that I was going to write to him. And you did something that was very beneficial. You, in a way, you pushed me. You said, release this, let it be heard. And I did. I put it online. It was picked up by Modon, and it became an article. And I think something happened to me, which was very important. There's no need for any fear. Just say what's on your mind. And I think that's really the backbone of what's happening, that people are letting go of many preconceived notions. And also, I think they're testing themselves. And freedom of expression is one of these sort of very important features of the past year. And I haven't spoken to you since. So it's roughly a year ago. And then your piece showed up in Center for Global Policy, and I thought I'd reach out. And can you maybe... No, sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, you're obviously doing important work in the meantime. So
I've been
you're
working...
not roaming streets of New York for a good reason. Both it's COVID and you're doing something in the meantime.
That's true. Actually, this has been the most productive year of my life. I've worked very hard on trying to capture and reflect on what's happening. And maybe I can gauge your mind and just your immediate reactions to the 1 year marker. It lands today.
Yeah.
Does it have any bigger meaning to you as somebody who's seen many protests come and go and has seen Lebanon on its roller coaster during the Civil War and after the Civil War? Does this occasion have special significance to you, more than just that it has been 1 year and positive things happened, negative things happened, many unexpected things happened, largely to the detriment of Lebanon? Just your reflections on what this anniversary means to you, and whether or not what you were seeing today, this sort of thousands of people showing up once again, trying to protest, trying to push, that this has long-term survivability, or are we witnessing the gradual sort of de-escalation and gradual withdrawal of what we saw a year ago, which was true passion and true certitude on the streets of Beirut? So just your immediate reaction to the 1 year anniversary.
Yeah, I mean, when the demonstrations started and we started going out in the streets, I wasn't an organizer. I was just one of the people who would go there and participate in the activities. I wasn't very hopeful, to tell you the truth. I was a kind of a reluctant protester, not reluctant in terms of the cause, but in terms of the hopes. But I felt that my pessimism about the prospect should not stand in the way of participating, because I don't want to be saying, okay, I didn't play my role, I can't complain about its failure. Not only because I want to complain, that's not the point. The point is that I felt there's a duty, even if you don't see huge chances of success. You have to play your role in what you think is a good action. And I thought it was the right action to do, but not with much hope. Now, unfortunately, this now is become vindicated, this attitude, in the sense that the revolution has fizzled out, if we don't want to use harsher words. It fizzled out. Today, they had a demonstration next to the port. The crowd was commemorating the anniversary of the revolution in a significant place where this explosion, historic explosion took place. And that's not because anything was accomplished, in a sense. It's not because people felt, oh, we got what we want, we no longer want to push harder. It's not like we are the moderates and the radicals. No, nothing. Everybody agrees nothing has been accomplished. And yet the enthusiasm for going out has almost diminished in a sense, and not because people are satisfied. They're back in their homes, because I think they lost hope in a way, or they posed hope. Not to say that lost hope completely. Maybe one would say that these things are accumulative things. They will come out in a different occasion, a different form, and the experience for this year, as well as for the 2015, the garbage protests, they will all add up at some point and culminate in a point that will be more sweeping than what we have seen. This might be the case. I cannot tell. I'm not an inevitabilist about victories of the good causes. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. Sometimes they got forgotten altogether. And people say, maybe in the long term things will happen. But I'm about the long terms. I'm kind of a Keynesian. In the long term we all die. So I don't know what the long term is. In the current term, at least, in the present, it doesn't look hopeful. People seem to reach the conclusion that nothing can be done at the public level, at the political activity level, and people now are seeking their own personal salvation. Either by leaving the country or getting their loved ones, young ones, leave the country, or by getting to manage through their crisis on a day-by-day basis. So the people have, in my opinion, Sergey, sort of, at least moment for the time being, have given up on a direct political change.
No, this is a bit of a hypothetical, but
yeah,
I'm curious from your side. Do you see the gradual sort of diminishing of this movement over the past year, largely to do with things that were not, impossible to predict? And this includes COVID, and obviously it includes the blasts. Would you put some maybe onus on those issues or those events, that any protest movement would have had to overcome severe obstacles given those sort of constraints? Or do you think that it would have diminished regardless? This is just, it wasn't sort of there to begin with, and maybe it's diminishing quicker now because of those events, but it would have diminished anyway.
Yeah, even signs of protest at home. At some point there will be, knocking on pots and pans, doing things at home. Even those things have diminished. That have to do with COVID. They are COVID-friendly activities, and I know people sing on balconies and do kind. And I think people here are not too scared of COVID. They take precaution. They wear their masks, and they could come out on different locations in reasonable amounts of numbers. I don't think it's a technical issue in that sense. It's not a health-related issue, although it might have played a role for sure. But I think it was fizzling out before that. In a way, I think COVID was good for the government to sort of restrict activities, but also was good for the activists, because they could sort of way say it's COVID, we're not out. But I think the spirit, the lack of other alternatives that are, as I said, COVID compatible, did not emerge, which indicates something. About the enthusiasm for the revolution and change made through the revolution, through the protests in the streets, have become less. The space for this has become narrower and narrower in the minds of people in general. While the economy keeps on collapsing and the anger growing, but it's not translating in any way in a political form.
So the backbone really wasn't there, even beyond the rage that we saw in the streets, beyond the euphoria as well in the first few days, that the structure wasn't there to begin with, that this was in a way destined to de-escalate at some point. And the reason I'm sort of pushing on this is because I think in the background, many people that had witnessed repeated attempts in the past were sort of ready for failure. And I don't mean it in terms of not wanting change. On the contrary, I think that's almost accepted now, that whether you're sectarian or secular, whether you're voting the same politicians in and out, doesn't matter. I think most people now are on board for some change. But there's this sort of, I don't want to say preconceived wisdom, maybe that's too much, but that there was a lot of caution at the start, saying that this isn't the first time, and nothing really of value has changed yet. And until that happens, this is probably going to wither away. Did you sense that even at the beginning? Let's say going back to maybe the first week of demonstrations. Did you?
People were going to the demonstrations. Also, like worried that there might not be many people this week because people are not going to go out.
Right.
So people were happy to see crowds, and they tell each other, "Come! It's a lot of people here. You will not be disappointed." People wanted it to succeed in that sense, but yes, that's a sign of caution. But that happens probably in every demonstration around the world. People don't know how many people will turn up. Revolutions generally surprise people. They don't go assured of their presence there in the street and their success. However, I think of course there is another merit to these demonstrations and activities. They might shape a generation in some sense. They might influence the views of people, the experiences. It might change their future behavior, and that might be something to look forward to in the future, and another turn under different circumstances.
Right.
This experience might manifest itself in some form or another towards the same aims of the revolution, but done at a different time in a different manner. But I think there is a deeper problem about, if you want to understand why the revolution fizzled out. The question has to start with why do we need the revolution in a place like Beirut to start with?
Right.
This is where my piece started. Macron, when he came here, the French president, he one of the journalists, after he met with some of the president and the other politicians, she asked him, "Why did you meet with those people, corrupt people?" And he said to her, "Look, I didn't vote for them. You voted for them. So they represent you." Now, the question is, in a democracy like Lebanon, why do we need a revolution? Usually in democracy, you might have a demonstration to express your anger at something, but then you translate this in the elections. And the demonstration usually is either to demand early elections or to send a signal to the ruling party or parties that we are not happy. If you don't change your behavior, we're going to throw you out in the next elections. It's a signal, since you can't have elections every day to test the people's opinions, you give signal through demonstrations. Now, but in a country like Lebanon, where you have people are capable of voting, why is it they are not capable of using that to communicate their desires through representation? And after all, when the Syrians went out the street, what they wanted is to have the right to vote, genuine vote. And then they will be able to express their will through the vote. And that happens in other cases. In most revolutions around the day we know about, usually revolutions happen for one or several reasons. One of them is that the people think that the votes were rigged.
Right.
This is the Belarusian one. This is the Iranian one, 2009. This was also the 2004 Ukrainian one. That the votes are rigged, and that's we demand a proper count of the votes. We don't have a demonstration against rigged votes here. We had an election 2018. There were a lot of anti-establishment groups. They failed to win more than one seat. There were talks about 2 seats they could have won had it not been for rigged voting or fraud. So this will, at the best scenario, from the point of view of those who are running, it will be 3 votes out of 128, 3 seats out of 128 seats in the parliament, which is dismal. For a country that at that point people were very dissatisfied with the performance of the existing political parties. Now, so the rigged vote issue is not an issue. People are not out to ask for proper counting of their votes. Now, in other cases, like in Venezuela, for example, the parliament was won by the opposition. Actually, the National Assembly is the majority, and they voted as the President Guaido, who is in opposition. What the Maduro regime did is that used the Supreme Court. The opposition won the parliament, and Maduro annulled the decision of the parliament to consider the second term of Maduro unconstitutional, void by the Supreme Court. So here we have democracy taking place and people voting for opposition, and the regime crushes this down. Neither of this happens. The opposition in 2018 couldn't make any real advancement in the elections, and they didn't. The claim wasn't that the votes were rigged. So why is it that the Lebanese are unable, despite their dissatisfaction with the performance of the existing political class, as they call them, to elect somebody else? And that is, I think we have to start, because if you can't elect, then you have to go, you need a revolution to do that. But how can you explain the need? You have to explain first the failure of electing these people. Yeah.
No, that's the perfect segue actually into your piece. And it's the Lebanese Predicament, which appeared at the Center for Global Policy's website. And it's I think a very short and concise sort of, it's almost like point by point why the protests are not sort of yielding fundamental change, and also why there may be one community that's largely reluctant to participate. And the second point is where we had our conversation in Martyrs Square. You actually hinted at that, and we talked a few minutes about that issue. So I'll leave that to later, but let's start with the beginning. Your piece opens up with a question. Recent protests in Lebanon have shown a strong and widespread rejection of the status quo in the country's politics. But if that is the case, why do voters in the country seem to keep electing the same political parties and leaders they think are corrupt and incompetent? And you offer 2 points. The first is that the electoral law may be challenging, but that doesn't really offer a clear and concise answer as to that. That still does not explain why the usual suspects are brought back. And the second point is sectarian quotas that everyone seems to be screaming and shouting about. But even then, that doesn't offer a fundamental answer. So if you don't mind, let's go into both. But in terms of where the appetite is for change, and let's start with electoral law. Do you see that as changing anytime soon? Even when it's always debated, even when protesters are sort of bringing it up regularly. I mean, do you see that happening after a year of pushing for reform? In a way, we can reform the system if we really wanted to. But what is it about electoral law that keeps it sort of stagnating the way it is?
Yeah, I offered this explanation not to agree with it. I offered it as the garden variety of explanations, the cliche explanations of why we can't change that. So I think it plays a role in the same way the Electoral College in the US plays a role in getting a president without winning the popular vote.
Right.
That's also part of the electoral law that makes somebody gets elected while losing the popular vote and representing the whole of the United States. So things like that can favor certain groups over others. The same thing happens at the level of the Senate as well. The Senate favors the Republican because it treats small ruler states as equal to big populated one that tends to vote Democrat. Right. So in a way, there are always these kinds of things. Electoral laws are never. Maybe in Lebanon they are done tailored to the taste of the political parties. Although the political parties themselves compete, it's not like they agree. It's a bargaining. It's a hard bargain between them. But this will not explain. It might explain that the playing field is not. It's not plain. It's not flat between the contestants, but doesn't explain the dismal performance of the opposition. It might explain that they are working at a certain disadvantage, because any kind of electoral law you would imagine would have serious problems. The one that had the most serious disadvantage for emerging parties is the majoritarian one, which has been practiced throughout the history of Lebanese elections until the last one. The last one was not a majoritarian one, was a proportional representation, which should in principle allow new groups and parties and candidates to seek, achieve some level of victory, because all they need is to get, certain percentage of the votes, small one, and they get a seat.
Yeah.
And yet they couldn't do that. And the question is, the answer that it's electoral law would require, what kind of electoral law would actually make these people win? I can't imagine one. The most favored one is a proportional representation, and Lebanon is one district. But that also would have the same obstacle for the people. I can't see why this one would suddenly translate the votes, while the last one couldn't do the same job. Translate the votes into winning some seats in the parliament, significant number of seats in the parliament, not necessarily a majority, but not only one or at most 3 seats out of all of this. So in a sense, the electoral law, I haven't seen a technical argument why another electoral law would actually achieve the results while the current ones don't. All the complaints are the laws are not fair. They are not fair, but the lack of fairness does not explain the kind of performance, the weak performance of the opposition, the anti-establishment groups. A more fair one, in the sense it doesn't cater for one group or another, although indirectly it might serve some groups. By the way, Birri is the main guy who calls for Lebanon being one district without any sectarian barriers and all of that. So there, in a way, I don't think he's saying it only, because he knows it's not going to happen, as a threat that we're going to achieve more under this than under the current one. So if you want to change the system, this is our proposal. So I think this kind of usual cliche explanation of the failure is not correct. Now, the sectarian quotas in the parliament, it also does not explain. The sectarian quotas ensure that each group community gets a certain number of seats in the parliament. It doesn't guarantee that the same political parties, that the ruling ones, are going to be voted in. You can always have the option of choosing somebody else from the same sect that you think is not implicated in the corruption that has been taking place the last, I don't know how many decades. So in a way, that doesn't explain why people don't vote out those people they think corrupt and replace them by people from the same sect that are not supposed to corrupt. So the sectarian division itself, when it comes to election day, does not explain. Had there been a majority for change, a significant majority, a sensible majority for change, this would have been made visible by elections. It might not translate into majority in the parliament because of the electoral law is not totally equidistant from different parties, but it would have achieved a major number of seats in the parliament. So I don't think those two explanations succeed in giving us a proper account of the performance of the anti-establishment parties. I, on the other hand, think there is something which can explain a bit this phenomena, and it can explain also, might explain also why the revolution fizzled out.
Okay, before we go there, before we go into the potential answers for why we're seeing this sort of repetition, I want to gauge your mind on the issue of the Senate, or at least the debate surrounding the Senate. This is something that's been discussed for way too long, and it's the mechanism is available. I mean, it's stated several times. It's in Ta'if, other places, and yet it never materializes. Would you put the burden there on is it a failure of politicians to not sort of establish it, or is it something that you would maybe lean towards the population, that we're not ready to put the issue of religion, or let's say, or sectarianism, or quotas, or whatever, in its place, meaning that it would resemble more more like a Senate in the US where states are equal, like you mentioned earlier. Are we not there yet psychologically? And is that why it hasn't happened? Because I'm curious, it should be very straightforward to sort of enhancing the civil state, putting sectarianism in a chamber where it
Yeah.
belongs and it can debate existential issues, but not day-to-day affairs. Where would you put the burden,
Yeah.
at least on that issue? Because that's one issue. That's a way of reforming the state that's been sort of discussed, and yet that just never materializes.
Well, I mean, the push for this should come from the parliament. And there hasn't been any appetite in the parliament for such change because it can upset power. People might adjust to it. It's not like they will, turn out to be losers in it. But there hasn't been appetite among the political parties, and there has been an appetite in the street for this. It's not even one of the slogans of the demonstrators.
Exactly.
And I'm not sure it would be an important one. Take Iraq, for example, just to compare Iraq with Lebanon. Iraq as a sectarian, ethno-sectarian division. Iraq, Kurds, Shiites, Sunnis. And the Iraqi constitution doesn't do quotas. There is no mention of any ethnicity or sect in the Iraqi constitution, except for the Kurds, because they have this autonomous region. So they recognize as having, so that's a kind of a federal system of some sort, or semi-federal system. It's autonomous region with the history of being autonomous. But nothing is mentioned. Yet the voting pattern for the Iraqi people has been sectarian. Shiite votes for Shiite parties and because the Shiite are a majority in Iraq, they have the majority of seats in the parliament. And as a result, the prime minister, which is the most important position in the Iraqi state, is taken by Shiite, has been taken by a Shiite, not by an agreement. It's not like Lebanon, the prime minister has to be Shiite. The prime minister is Shiite because the majority of the people in the country are Shiite, and they vote for Shiite parties, and the Shiite parties decide with some alliances here and there about the prime minister. Right. So here we have a constitution that is totally non-sectarian in that sense. And there is no need for a Senate in it to relegate all the sectarian problems. I'm not sure what would, and yet in Iraq, the sectarian voting dominates. Now, maybe the Iraqi system is better than ours because it might, in the future, allow for people to move away from sectarianism, while the Lebanese one, in a way, crystallized it into the political order by the constitution. But it's not automatic, and it's not clear what would the Senate be. The Senate is supposed to express a balance of power between the sects because they have two representatives in that body. But the power between the sects in the street is not, on the ground, is not equal. So in Lebanon, there has always been imbalance between the groups, unfairness in a sense between the groups. And this kind of unfairness needs to be dealt with. Rejecting sectarianism should not lead to us to be blind to sectarian injustice.
Right.
So if some groups in Lebanon, they are sects, have more power than others unjustifiably, this is not going to be at all conducive to the elimination of sectarianism. You eliminate sectarianism first by achieving a genuine, just balance of power between the groups. An imbalance of power would always make the powerful stick to their groups because they are powerful because of their solidarity, and those who are disempowered wait for the moment where they can actually emerge and replace the powerful. So they live in resentment and waiting for revenge. And the people who are in power know that, and they keep, monitoring the situation that this will not happen in the future. So this kind of imbalance between groups is blocking is a block to any kind of reduction in sectarian sentiments and behavior, especially when it comes to voting in this case.
That's a great segue into unpacking potential explanations. And I'm going to quote you to you here. To understand the predicament of the Lebanese, it is helpful to see them as people trapped in a kind of prisoner's dilemma, where reasonable people cannot avoid making non-optimal choices. The dilemma for the Lebanese is that it is risky for them to abandon or weaken the current community leaders unless they are assured that members of other communities will do the same. Without such an assurance, the group that abandons its leaders when others do not will emerge as a loser. We can start with prisoner's dilemma. What exactly you mean by that? And whether or not the tools are there to sort of shield those concerns.
Yeah, without going to expansion of the prisoner's dilemma itself as a game theoretic model.
No, but I meant just in the
Lebanese context.
Yeah. No, not the 101 course.
No. But if you going to go and vote, and as a member of a community, and you're aware of yourself as a member of a community, let's not imagine something different, because people do think of themselves to a great extent as members of community. Mm-hmm. Now, they are asked to replace their current leaders because they are not doing a good job. Mm-hmm. Now, they think, would other members of other groups do the same? Get rid of their own leaders. Because if they don't at the same time, and I don't give my own leader, established leaders, my vote, and others do, my community will emerge much weaker. Why? Because I don't have a ready replacement for my leaders, while the other community would not scatter its vote. If suppose it doesn't scatter its votes, my community will be much weaker, will emerge in a much weaker position than the other community. So for me to be able to not give my votes to the usual suspects, usual leaders, I must be assured, at least to a certain extent, that the other groups were going to do something similar. So no group will emerge at the end of the day weakened by scattering the votes.
Right.
And that kind of mutual assurance is difficult to give. But you can read signals of it. You can see what kind of atmosphere is around it. The various elections in Lebanon that happened since 2005 at least showed a significant solidarity among Shiites for their established leadership. The Sunni in 2005 showed also significant solidarity over their leadership, but this has become weaker as a result of failures and defeats and all of this, and mismanagement and what you want to call it, oppression as well, assassinations, etc. The leadership has become weaker. Now, further elections showed that the Shiite community showed still persistent solidarity with its ruling establishment within the community. And now you're asking people to come from non-Shiite communities and ditch their leaders out, while they are sort of assured that, or at least suspicious that the Shiites will not do the same. Now, the October 17th moment is important in that respect, because now we have a crisis looming with the capital control and the collapse of the lira.
Yes.
Then people thought this is big enough. Even the Shiite solidarity might be shattered. And now the Shiite voters will not resume their regular habits of voting overwhelmingly. When I talk about Shiite, I'm not talking about every single one. I'm talking about the overwhelming number. The votes that Amal and Hezbollah get in the Shiite community is above 80% from the votes who vote. And maybe it goes a bit down, sometimes it goes a bit up, but it's a significant amount. By any democratic standard, anything above 70 is overwhelming support.
Yeah.
And so when people go out in demonstration in 2017, everybody was thinking about, would the Shiite go out? That was the question in the mind, because we could see easily that the Sunnis and the Christians are going out. The scenes from Tripoli, from Jaldi, from the Shabak, it showed that there is a appetite among the Shiite and the Sunnis, among the Sunnis and Christian communities for demonstrations. These are the three big communities in terms of voting numbers. Now, yes, the Shiite went out in certain locations, in Bit Sur, Kfar Rumman, a bit of Balba, but the presence of the Shiite was shy. And it did not become bigger with time. It becomes sort of way as oscillating. And people were looking at it. Are they going to go out? And of course, the leadership went out against the protesters and the revolution. And the fact that Hezbollah and specifically Nasrallah has a quite strong command over the Shiite community. He has a kind of sanctified, almost divine qualities for the community, made it difficult for people to actually prioritize their economic frustration over their allegiances. What happens then is that when people saw that the Shiite community are not going out in the numbers that will ensure that the Shiites are in it, people started to feel that, well, now we have a communal conflict rather than a revolution. Right. Some communities are not into it, and this started to appear in the confrontation in Shayyah and other places, sometimes in downtown, right, where people started to see that communities are not on the same page here. And once there is the ugly head of communal conflict appears, people shy away and say, look, we don't want a civil war. Maybe the Lebanese didn't learn to love each other from the civil war, but they learned that it's not a good idea to kill each other. So they haven't learned to like each other, but they've learned something from the civil war. Plus, the other communities think they are at a huge disadvantage militarily in confronting the Shiite. Even if they want to do so, it will be at best destructive for both, or at worst destructive for everybody. And then the second option will be a major defeat for the other communities. So in a way, once the demonstration hit the Shiite solidarity wall, it could no longer become a revolution. It's either it's going to fizzle out, people go back to their homes, or if it continues, it's going to be a communal conflict.
I want to unpack this further, but before then, we were in Martyrs Square when a lot of this was happening, and Hariri resigns roughly a year ago, plus or minus, plus a few weeks off, but he resigns after the protests begin. Would you apply sectarian sort of thinking to the fact that he may return now, that the imbalance is sort of recalibrating a bit in that sense? Forget the sort of chants against the prime minister and the prime minister steps down. Not that, more like applying that sort of lexicon, if you will. The Sunni imbalance is now sort of finding itself once again under Shia protection. And I'm using a bit offensive language here, but saying that, and that this is a recalibration rather than a sort of protest movement dying and the political class winning. It's more sectarian recalibration and sort of back to the old consensus way of governing.
Yeah, but there is a structure of power. I mean, maybe people will find it distasteful to emphasize the sectarian thing. We are repeating the same rhetoric. But I think when there are communal injustices, it's unfair not to mention them. It's not racist to go to South Africa before the end of apartheid and say the white people have power and the blacks are disenfranchised from power. That's not racism. That's describing an imbalance between communities. Of course, everybody thinks that was unfair and imbalanced. Now, so talk about races and sects is sometimes needed for justice between groups. Justice is not only between individuals, but also between groups. And that sometimes when it's lacking, it needs to be pointed out. Not because we think that people should think along group groups and see themselves only as members of the group. But if there is injustice between groups, you need to address that and talk about it directly. I think in the case of Hariri or any Sunni prime minister, again, the protests and the revolution showed that the Sunni position is dispensable. You can take it out, bring it back. It's not fixed. It's under the mercy of the main power brokers in the country. Now, there has been a shift in the Christian community as well. That shift is not yet translated politically because we don't have elections. But the perception among most people is that the Aonis or the Free Movement Party has become much weaker in the Christian community. So we have already a weak Sunni leadership, a weakened president and leader of his community has happened both on the ground, while we don't see anything like that among the Shia. Neither an overwhelming feeling that people are not going to vote for them next time, nor that any of those positions are going to be removed. The Christian political situation has changed as a result of the demonstrations, and specifically the blast, the explosion.
Right.
And also the Sunnis are seen as, the prime minister is dispensable. But the Shia community, we don't see any visible signs of a major shift in the sentiment of the people, at least not vis-a-vis the main leader of the community, which is Nasrallah. And we don't see any change in the official situation, that Birri's position is not threatened at all until he dies, it seems, but has no threat from the community itself or from the political structure. So in a way, you have an imbalance between communities. Some communities are changeable, both at the level of who represents them in the states or at the level of the political sentiments in the community, and one of them remains to a more extent solidified. And that kind of imbalance makes it difficult for people to make the required change. So next time there's election, I would imagine the same phenomena to some extent will emerge, maybe with some change, with some minor changes, that the Shiite will show solidarity, others will not want to even weaken their leaders even more, while one group, important group, that's not a minor group, that's a group that has significant numbers demographically, as well as already empowered by an extra factor of having weapons. So you give them extreme power over the rest if you don't show some level of solidarity behind your usual suspect.
Let's go there, and maybe we can address it in the protests, sort of, and the whole thing that's happened the last year, pushes for reform, and this issue sort of in the background. I'll quote you to you, and you sort of it's a section called "Missed Opportunities." In October 2019, people took to the streets demanding change in response to worsening economic conditions. The demonstrations evidenced a strong and widespread rejection of the status quo. They also provided an opportunity for rival communities to publicly signal to each other their readiness to turn the tables on their political leaders, and thus provide mutual assurances to each other. Unfortunately, this opportunity was not taken up. So before we go further on that, would you argue that at least the first week, and you mentioned this earlier, it was Nabati and other places, you saw an unusual sign of shared experience, that all Lebanese for a moment were potentially on board to sort of let go of the prisoner's dilemma, if you will, and see things differently. Would you go that far? Or was that all just sort of not even a fracturing of the status quo, that it was just very superficial? And I'm talking really maybe even the first days, that sort of from Tripoli all the way to Nabatieh, the images, you couldn't tell where the protests were happening. They all looked the same. So was that a moment of fracturing and maybe challenging the prisoner's dilemma, or it really wasn't there?
Well, I mean, it was a kind of a pregnant moment in some sense. It could come up with something. But what kind of fetus would deliver is not so clear. What is the newborn? In my opinion, this kind of pregnancy for the Shiite community was aborted, and as a result, the whole thing was aborted. If one community is not going to play to the tune of a revolution, it's not possible for the rest to play for that on that tune. So I think what happened, Nasrallah, many Shiite who were their sentiment, and a great number of them were in favor of the revolution at the beginning. But then when Nasrallah came out, very, very suspicious, very not even lukewarm endorsement, actually coming as a defender of the regime in some sense, people were disappointed, but yet it swayed them.
Right.
And there's a narrative in the Shiite community to some extent. People ask me, but why are you saying this? I mean, there are a lot of Shiites I talk to, and they hate Hezbollah, and they hate Amal, and they hate this, and they hate Basir. Of course, they hate Basir. All of them hate Basir. In Biqa, most of them hate Berri. So it's not really, there's no controversy there. But I think in the Shiite community, they're like the European community, the EU, in the sense that in many countries in the EU, they make a distinction between the political wing of Hezbollah and the military wing.
Mm-hmm.
The Europeans think that the political wing is okay, the military one is bad. The Shiites have the opposite categorization. They think there is a political wing and there is a military wing, which is the muqawamah, the resistance. The bad people.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. I've never heard it done that way. That's almost like that's flipping it on its head. It's a very useful analogy.
Yeah, I think both distinctions are absurd. The Europeans is an absurd distinction because this political wing gets its orders from the military one. So separating them is a bit of a gimmick. You can do that only for a short period when you are negotiating with the IRA. You don't want to take the terrorists. You talk to what you call the political wing, but that's only a temporary thing, just to sit on the table and negotiate, but not as a permanent division. The Shiites do it the opposite way. They think there is a political side of Hezbollah. So maybe Hussein Hassan is not good. He's corrupt. He builds a big house. This is my own community talks about him in those terms. But Nasrallah is not. And that makes it impossible to actually not give your votes to them, because you're not giving your votes to Hussein Hassan. You give it to Nasrallah, basically. Nasrallah comes out on TV and says, I want you to give your vote to this list, which includes Berri's people,
right,
Hezbollah's people. And that's why this division in the minds of the Shiite community is also not very helpful. It's like when people say, okay, our leader is great, but the people around him are corrupt. In this case, it's more sensible because there's this division between the political side and those who are into the real fight, those who are protecting the weapon. So in a way, there is a similarity there. And I think both, as I said, both distinctions in both cases, Europeans and the Shiite community are not helpful and fictitious distinctions in some sense. Yeah.
I'd like to go there with you, and I'll quote you to you. Although many Shia joined the demonstrations, their overall participation was markedly less visible than that of other communities. Fewer and smaller demonstrations took place in Shia-dominated areas than in Sunni and Christian ones. And you go on to point that there's two main reasons for that kind of reluctance. The first is an allegiance to Hassan Nasrallah in particular, and that one I think is probably we can start there, but I'd like to also address the second one as well, that the empowerment comes from not necessarily demographics. It's an empowerment of weapons and maybe politics by force. But let's start with Hassan Nasrallah. Did his respect in his community over the last year evolve in a way that it's easier now to challenge him regardless of your confession? You hear people screaming and shouting how much they hate him in other sort of community and majority sort of areas. If you were to look at the last year, do you see that there's an easier sort of ability to confront him from within, or is that unchanged? that it's still the way it was a year ago and it's not changing anytime soon?
Yeah, at least in the demonstrations we've seen in the Shiite community, we don't have this.
Right.
That's more of a taboo there.
Mm-hmm.
You might have some protesters in downtown who would do this in a context that are in a situation, a location that allows them.
Right.
And this is a kind of, it's considered as a breakthrough, as a kind of as a bold move. To criticize him publicly, and the whole point of kullun yani kullun initially was to include him, as if including him is something that you have to struggle with, that you have to like, instead of instead of saying, okay, we target him, he's a major problem, and no, he's just one of them, and that's way of making it acceptable more.
Yes.
The truth is that for the Shiite community, he's not one of them. And when I talk about Shiite community, I'm talking the overwhelming numbers. I'm not talking everybody. He's not one of them. He might not be doing what he should be doing against those bad players. Maybe because he has other considerations that are reasonable as well, but he's not one of them. He's above them, and he's powerful. Maybe he should be doing something. People in the Shiite community complain sometimes about the alliance with Basir. Why do you want to ally with Basir? Why don't you get rid of Basir? But that doesn't imply that there is that Nasrallah is, or Hezbollah is, implicated in the corruption of Basir, but that they, for other even higher reasons, are tolerating this corrupt idiot.
Let's say Hezbollah in general. Is there an easier? Are the circumstances more favorable now to talk about Hezbollah the way you would talk about Amal, for example, or Mustaqbal, or Lu'wat, or whatever you want? That you can actually use that group's name more and more in the debate of reform, or is it still beyond Hassan Nasrallah himself, that the group itself is almost immune rather than that individual at the top?
Well, I don't think you can separate them. I think the group is, as I said, the group is not immune, even among the Shiite community. It's not immune criticism. This is why when they do that, they separate. They talk about even corrupt Hezbollah members who made money. Even Nasrallah himself went out and said some of our brothers are behaving improperly by accumulating money and showing. So he's above it all, and at the same time, he is the one. He reads the road. I mean, he appears almost weekly. He has a direct communication with the people. He is not. It's true he's sitting somewhere in the underground, but he among the politicians, the leaders, he has the most direct channel with his people. And most of his speeches are directed to that base. So every man, child, woman, older person sitting there, he speaks to them, to each one of them directly, and in a convincing, charismatic manner, with a lot of achievement behind him, a lot of experiences that solidified this trust in him. It becomes, you cannot isolate him from Hezbollah, and therefore, at the end of the day, he calls the shots, and people will deliver, whether it comes to not participating in the demonstrations or voting for the list recommended by Hezbollah or anything else. It will always materialize in that fashion. So in that sense, you have this block, and you cannot dismantle the system while the biggest block in that system remains intact, and the other blocks will become weaker, but you're not able to dismantle them because this will weaken them even much further for members of their community to tolerate. So in a way, that's the predicament that we have now at the moment. It doesn't mean that if Hezbollah is removed or doesn't have any weapons anymore, or Nasrallah is no longer a leader, something happens, it doesn't mean that Lebanon will become Switzerland.
Sure. Yeah.
So it would still be a long road for reform, but then revolutions like this one would have more chance of succeeding under that kind of circumstances.
But let's go into the empowerment issue. That if Hezbollah's weapons were actually reined in, and this is a sort of like this is more imagination than anything. If that group's weapons were somehow, if the group was disarmed the way all militia were disarmed after the civil war, because communities have coped in Lebanon without weapons, and I'm talking about serious weaponry, not sort of toy guns among kids and whatever, not the basic arms, real weapons. Other communities moved on, and their political leaders are ugly, they're corrupt, at times they're toxic, but the communities also moved on. Is it just impossible for one community to move on and surrender its weapons without feeling deeply disadvantaged? Or is it something that's beyond that? Because I'm curious where I agree with you that the key to proper reform in Lebanon, or for that matter, fundamental change, means all communities are more or less on the same footing. And weapons are not part of the discussion. Weapons are gone, and you can sort of deal with dirty politics the way any country deals with its dirty politics. But why is this community, why is that insecurity so deeply embedded? And is there a way out of that so that another protest, if it happens down the road, we wouldn't have to fall into the same trap over and over?
So I think there are two things here. One is the weapon. One thing is the weapons, and the other one is the voting behavior. Now, we can imagine the weapons are no longer there, but the Shiites still show solidarity with its leadership more than others do.
Right. Yeah.
Now, of course, if you think that solidarity among the Shiites is a result of the weapons and the protection of the weapons, then removing the weapons will also weaken the solidarity and put them at the same level of other communities. If we think that people in the Shiite are voting this way because they don't want to lose the weapons, that's one possibility. Now, it depends how they lose the weapons. If they lose the weapons in the same way the Nazi lost the weapons in the Second World War by major defeat and destruction of cities, villages, and communities, then definitely it will emerge as a defeated community with all the malaise and problems and suffering that will take place. So that's a kind of a different. Let's imagine this doesn't happen. The weapons are no longer there by some kind of a magical wand. They disappear, but everything remains the same, but they don't have weapons. How would this be? Initially, I think they'll become more solidified because they feel now they are exposed. And the weapons, like any kind of a power trip, you abuse your power vis-a-vis the other communities. And you are scared on the other community when you lose this power. So imagine this, you bully some kids in school because your big brother is watching and doesn't allow anybody to come close to you. And you keep on bullying them. And then your big brother at some point wants to go and study abroad and you're still in the school. And you will be distressed because you have abused that kind of power that your brother gave, the present your brother gave you. And that's a kind the Shiite feel in their hearts that they have actually not treated others equally in that sense. They felt empowerment at the very detailed level of fights between two taxi drivers. Their sectarian communal identity manifests itself in who has the upper hand in this conflict. That's between villages, between individuals. And the biggest manifestation of power by the weapons of Hezbollah in Lebanon is May 7th, 2008,
right,
where it was. And people think, okay, if we are no longer having this power over them, what prevents them from taking revenge at us? If not by attacking us, but at least by humiliating us, by not by showing a kind of tendency for evening the score in some form or another. So we are, and the second one, which is even more significant, is their participation in Syria.
Right.
If they think that also made them have blood on their hands, and now they will be more exposed without the weapons, if anything happens. So in a way, they have been implicated. The weapons have been used, endorsed in ways that makes them scared of losing it. So they are trapped in a sense. They trapped by the use of the weapons, have trapped them into not wanting those weapons to go away because they are afraid. Maybe most of this fear is psychological in the sense it will not materialize.
Yeah.
But psychological fears are real and have real political implications. So it's one should not underestimate them.
I'd like to quote your piece one more time. It's in a way you end the piece with that psychological perspective. Although all stand to gain considerably from holding their current political leaders accountable, not all communities make equal sacrifices in order to reach this situation. In relative terms, the Shia stand to lose more than others by changing the status quo. They would lose their unique military advantage and with it their political one, which we just addressed. This remains true even though changing the status quo would improve the conditions of the Shia in absolute terms, at least when seen from the perspective of alleviating the dire economic hardships that do not spare the Shia community. Sadly and irrationally, however, relative advantages often have more psychological pull than absolute ones. So, if we can maybe wrap it up with your thoughts on what it would take to match that situation, which we live through right now, with one that you mentioned earlier. Let's use the IRA. Let's use Northern Ireland as a case study. That's a community that felt extremely disadvantaged, a community that chose, in large ways, weapons over the political framework that was available. Decades of violence, of sort of an insurrection, and then Northern Ireland, nobody talks about it today. The IRA is history. The Catholic community found its way into the political fold in a way that's nonviolent, and the Protestants are no longer sort of they don't have that superior sort of British oversight backing them. On the contrary, Northern Ireland, in a way, moved on. It moved on from its sectarian quagmire. It moved on from its weapons, and psychologically, it seems to be largely heading in the right direction. I think of Belfast now as a tourism destination rather than car bombings and Bloody Sunday music that's sort of now in history books rather than on the radio. So that kind of sort of pacifying a conflict that in some ways mirrors ours, is there a psychological component that's missing right now?
Well, no, I think the North Ireland conflict lasted for a long time, and people were trapped also in these kinds of psychological fears and narratives. The solution came from the region, even global agreement. The Americans played a big role. In giving assurances to the Irish. That they will back their cause in some sense and making sure that the settlement is fair. Now, things like that could happen here. The external players are not there yet in the right mode. If something changes in Iran, you might see a different situation altogether in Lebanon. There might be some maybe chaotic period on the psychological level. People don't know how to make up their minds, how to live with the new situation. But eventually they will discover that, things are not that bad, especially the Shiite community will their fears about them being persecuted for what they have done, would fizzle out because they realize, we are still 1/3 of the country and we have still some kind of a solidarity among each other. So we're not simply going to be, taken over. It's a prisoner's dilemma in the sense that unless something happened from outside, in a sense, it doesn't. The players are trapped inside their calculations, and something could happen from inside as well, but I can't see it. The revolution was one of those possibilities of something happening. The economic collapse. Because the Shiites are suffering as much as everybody else from the economic collapse. Could have been an internal, this is big, this is the worst economic situation Lebanon has ever been in, apart from the famine, at the end of the First World War. But this is a serious one, and you would imagine that this could shake things internally. So in a way, things could happen internally. I can't see them now having said that this one has failed. It has changed other communities. The economic collapse and the blast made a political shift in the Christian community. And most likely, had there been elections now, that would have been translated into a major change in the voting patterns. In the Shiite community, this didn't happen for all these reasons I mentioned before. So it seems it will take more than this. And unfortunately, more than this might also by itself be quite bad if it's done by violence. But maybe there are other ways in which this might be resolved without much violence.
It actually also maybe helps explain why the Northern Ireland troubles did not cease really until there was proper external understanding. And the British were on board, the Irish were on board, and the Americans sort of pushed through the Good Friday Agreement. So I agree. And even in the Balkans, I mean, it took an agreement in Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, to end a very...
It took military force. It took bombing of Belgrade for a month to put them to their knees, and for surrendering the top leaders of the Serbian and others who were participating in it. So it took an outside intervener in some sense to break a kind of impasse.
When it comes to Kosovo, absolutely. NATO bombing and all that in the late 90s, but it wasn't Croatian military, it wasn't Serbian, Bosniak. You had NATO involved, and you had sort of...
Yes.
So, and I agree with you that those conflicts, we don't know. They may have lingered on without that kind of external intervention. So I appreciate sort of the prisoner's dilemma, but it's a very domestic dilemma, that there is an external sort of story at play, and Lebanon is held hostage to it. Bashshar, I'm going to end it by saying two things. One is a sort of a bittersweet. The other one is more humorous. The first, I was in a daze. I had not slept. I was in a sort of almost like a zombie at my father's funeral. And I was shaking hands with sort of the usual suspects, people that I would not really want to see while I'm mourning. And it's almost like you just go with emotions, and you're unaware really of what's happening. And I sort of turn to my right, and I see you. And Samer Frangi is sitting in sort of the audience. And I wandered off where I was supposed to be, shaking hands, to sit next to you guys and talk. And I remember that moment. It's almost like these are the voices I'd rather hear, and I'd rather talk to you guys than talk to these people. And I really enjoyed those few minutes we had. It was almost like an escape from tragedy. The second, my friend, is that I have expired immensely since I met you. I look horrible, but you keep improving, and I don't know how you do it. As the years go by, is it plastic surgery? So
yes.
So I need for you. Do I need to stretch my face? How does this work?
It's the good life in Lebanon, Okay.
But isn't that that's a stretch?
There is one thing here, and the weather is good in Lebanon, and you know why? Mainly, the weather is good because the Lebanese can't do much about it. So it's you can always rely on it, and that's where I'm put my bets. I put my bet on the nice weather.
Hey man, sunsets never disappoint. with or without trash. But I think the colors are quite colorful because we really polluted our country.
Yes, there's a fringe benefit to that.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time sort of unpacking your piece. It'll be posted on the episode in the details box. And let's do this again, maybe reflect on where things are moving down the road once more. I always appreciate your thoughts.
It'll be my pleasure. Yeah. Great to see you.
Thanks for listening. And a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.